episode number 177 of the Wholesome Fertility Podcast. Welcome to the Wholesome Fertility Podcast. I'm Michelle, a fertility acupuncturist here to provide you with resources on how to create a wholesome approach to your fertility journey. My guest today is Emily Ginn. Emily is an IVF warrior, coach, fellow podcaster, and mama to two boys. She gives tools to women so that they can learn how to cut their overwhelming anxiety in order to get love and laughter back in their lives. With 15 years in social work and certification from the Life Coach School, Emily has taught so many women going through the IVF process how to deal with shame, trauma, and become more mindful during one of the most intense processes in their lives. So welcome to the podcast, Emily.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to talk with you.
Me too. So you're a fellow podcaster. I'm excited to have you on. And I'd love for you to introduce yourself and give us your background, how you got into the work that you do.
Yes, thank you. So yes, I have a podcast. It's called IVF This. So I am an IVF / infertility coach. Most of the stuff that I talk about relates to specifically to IVF because that's kind of been my experience. But just like with anything, you can kind of extrapolate. I mean, I could talk about weight loss and it'd still be applicable to some of the stuff I talk about. So the backstory is I was a social worker for 15 years. Mm-hmm. And throughout that 15 years, so I have a bachelor's and master's degree in social work. And throughout that time, my wonderful husband and I experienced around 9 years of infertility.
Wow.
So we're the type of overachieving couple. So we have male and female factor infertility because neither one of us can be outdone by the other. So I had one of my ovaries removed due to what's called a mucinous cystadenoma. So just a really large cyst, essentially like crowding out the entire reproductive cavity. It was not cancerous or anything, thankfully. And then for him, he has low motility. So I always joke with him that his guys are just kind of standing around looking at each other because that's basically what they're doing. And so we started trying spring-ish of 2012. And by like July of 2013, we were like, okay, there's something we're not accounting for. And so we started doing workups, and that's where we found his. We were living in Houston at the time, and that's where we established care with a reproductive endocrinologist. And that's where we found out what was going on with me too. Mm-hmm. Flash forward like a couple weeks later, and I had what's called an ovarian torsion, where the weight of the cyst connected to the ovary caused it to fall over on the ligaments. Excruciatingly painful, 0 out of 10. I would never recommend it. So I had to have a couple of surgeries to correct it and then eventually to remove the ovarian tube. And then, like, by some miracle, we actually got pregnant spontaneously.
Wow.
He is now 7.5 years old.
Amazing.
And he is our less than 1% chance of getting pregnant spontaneously.
Yeah.
And then we got this kind of starry-eyed naivete, like, oh, it happened naturally the first time, so it's gonna happen again. And so we went down another 1.5 years of, all of the anger, the angst, the grief, all of the emotions that we experience during infertility, or any time you're going for something that you really want and not getting it, like getting turned back at every turn. So eventually we went back, we did 4 IUI cycles, intrauterine insemination, that were not successful, not unsurprisingly with male factor infertility. Right. And then we eventually did our first round of IVF, we got 2 chromosomally normal embryos. Our first transfer was successful. He's a very feisty and feral 4-year-old. And our second transfer was not successful. And that was in July of 2020. And it was a very huge blow to us because we had kind of expected, we had this like I would call it like an entitlement that it was just going to work. And it did not. And so my husband and I we did a lot of soul searching. We did a lot of praying. We did a lot of conversations. And eventually in May of 2021, we decided to go through one last round. It was kind of like, here goes our college try. You know, we don't know. This is just, we want to make sure we leave everything on the table. And remarkably, that was actually successful with one ovary at 37 years old. And so I am 34 weeks pregnant with our
Oh, wow. Amazing.
last child.
Congratulations. That's great.
Thank you. So in that time, I noticed that a lot of the infertility community, or if anyone spent any time, especially in the Facebook groups, this is not a knock to anyone who's on the Facebook groups. I'm still in there too. But what I noticed was this tendency towards, number one, toxic positivity.
Mm-hmm.
And not like everyone talked about validating emotions,
Mm-hmm.
but no one really addressed the trauma associated
Mm-hmm.
with infertility, with IVF, with failed transfers, with miscarriages, things like that. And everyone's idea of like, well, just keep trying. Mm-hmm. Without like accounting for individual, what I call failure tolerance, a person's ability to handle and move forward from failures, mm-hmm. which is not a character deficit. It's all of us have different failure tolerances. Mm-hmm. And so the pandemic hit, and the type of social work that I was doing in the medical community was no longer really applicable. Everyone was just trying to keep people from not dying. And so I decided that time was the perfect opportunity for me to move into coaching. And so I've been doing that ever since.
Amazing. So yeah, you definitely have been through a roller coaster of your own, for sure. And that it really is a roller coaster. Like you go up and then you go down and then you have your ups and you're like, oh, okay. And then you don't expect that down. And then it just kind of, it's like this back and forth.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that actually speaks a lot to the way we perceive infertility trauma, because trauma, the way that our media kind of curates what trauma looks like, is measured in severity. Mm-hmm. But that's not actually how trauma from a clinical standpoint is measured. Mm-hmm. I like to think of it as like it's measured by surprise.
Mm-hmm. Like you're not expecting it to come.
Right. If your expectation is completely like the polar opposite of what your reality is, what's happening in your reality, that is going to be more than likely, it's not a guarantee, but it's going to be pretty traumatic for the person.
Yeah.
And so I think that's where a lot of the roller coaster comes in, because just like us, we got pregnant almost immediately after I had my ovary removed. So we kind of thought that was the biggest problem. Mm-hmm. And then lo and behold, we're back a year and a half later, kind of where we started from. And that was really traumatic. Like, what? No, we beat this crap. What are you talking about? We have to go back. And so I think that roller coaster really does speak to how traumatic these experiences can be.
Yeah, absolutely. And so how does a person process trauma? Because not everybody has access to talking to somebody who understands clinically like how to handle it. Mm-hmm. And people go through the trauma. Sometimes they go through the trauma and they're afraid to talk about it because there's a lot of shame. How does one begin? Like, what is something that somebody can do to at least work through it or figure out what is this that I'm facing or dealing with? Because it feels so overwhelming.
Yeah. So a couple of things. Number one, infertility trauma is a little bit sneaky, because I consider it like a compounded trauma. So it's not as if it's this big event that happens. It's like these little tiny micro traumas that happen over and over and over. And then it kind of snowballs. And then by the time you're looking at it, you're not able to sleep. You're having trouble functioning. You're having trouble in your relationships. And then we don't give it the air and the kind of understanding that it deserves.
Yeah.
So your first step is to acknowledge that there could be a trauma. Like, you don't have to buy into the premise completely, but acknowledge that maybe some of the things that have happened could be perceived as trauma. Because again, when you first start out, you are going to be bumping up against our cultural and social narrative of what trauma is, right?
Right.
And our culture and social narrative of what trauma is: rape, murder, car accidents, these horrible things that happen in humanity, which are traumatic, right?
Yeah.
I'm not going to take anything away from those, but those aren't the only things.
Right.
And so understanding that could take a little bit of time to kind of unpack. And the second thing is to seek help, whether that's talking to a counselor, whether that's talking to a coach, whether that is just outreach for a support group. Support doesn't have to look any one specific way. But I will say that if you are having trouble functioning, like you can't get out of bed, you can't moderately regulate your emotions to the point you can function in society, you're probably going to need counseling.
Yeah.
And to speak with your primary care doctor or your OB, see how you can easily get plugged in. If you're really like not functioning and you're suicidal or homicidal ideation, call 911, get help immediately. But for a lot of us, it's like this underlying thing that we don't really acknowledge or talk about. So like on IVF This, on my podcast, I have 2 or 3 episodes specifically dedicated to trauma.
Yeah.
And if just nothing, to open your mind up to the possibility that what you have been through is traumatic. I think that's the biggest first step.
Oh, for sure, without a doubt. And it is something that, like you said, is very sneaky. I think that is such a beautiful way to say it. It's like so right on, because it's not something that people are expecting to happen, and it is something that happens over time, and it builds up on itself. And it also is not something that a lot of people understand. It's like there's almost a stigma to it. Like nobody really knows exactly what it's like unless you're in it.
Yes. Oh, and that's I'm so sorry. I'm about to digress for just a second.
Yeah.
But yes, I think that one of the biggest hindrances in the infertility community is how, and it's not like an intentional hindrance or anything like that. It's a lot of the subtext of our society. But for everything that the world is, and how sexualized things are, by and large, we're still especially in the United States, we're still a pretty prudish society. And so people talk about infertility, they're like, oh, I don't want to know about your marriage or your business or anything like that. And so there's this like prudish ideology tied to when we have those types of conversations, which is why generally people get uncomfortable. And when people are uncomfortable, they just say stupid things.
Yep.
Right.
That's so
to either diffuse the tension that they're feeling or to diffuse the perceived tension in the conversation.
Yeah.
Right. So
that is so true. Like that is what happens. This is why it's so confusing, because if you're going through it and you're having somebody say those things, it pisses you off, but at the same time, it's confusing because you're like, I can't blame them because I know they don't mean to do this. But at the same time, so it's the most confusing freaking feeling. It's all in one. You're just like, I know they didn't mean this, and I know that, like, but it's like, I'm so pissed at the same time. And it's just like everything at once.
Yes.
And so it's hard to even like navigate that.
And then we get mad at ourselves for getting mad at the people. And like, it's just this
it's a mishmash of
storm
everything.
of shame. And, there's this, the cultural perception that a woman is put here on this earth to procreate.
Yeah.
Like that's the only value add that we have, is to make babies.
Yeah.
Which is laughable. But then you have trouble making babies. And so then are you a woman? Are you doing, like, what have you done wrong? What are you doing wrong?
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's so much shame that's tied into this process. And our society doesn't do a whole hell of a lot to help us
Mm-hmm.
unravel that shame. Not that it's society's job, but society has done a lot of work destigmatizing a lot of different things.
Mm-hmm.
And so it just kind of goes to show you how much work there is still left to do, how much judgment and how much stigma is still kind of tied up. I use the example of The Handmaid's Tale, which is a phenomenal book. I have a little bit of issue with the series, but that's neither here nor there.
Mm-hmm.
But even in the book, even in the media perception of this story, barren women, barren, I'm going to use air
Mm-hmm.
quotes, folks,
Yeah.
barren women are perceived as these like mean, heartless, baby grubbing people, which that is a social message that has been perpetuated from biblical times.
Well, even just the label
Barren,
itself.
so
Right.
awful.
Yeah, well,
Yeah,
yeah, and
absolutely.
I don't love the I word either. Infertility. I know that it
Right,
means what it means, and it's kind of like you need to use it to describe it, but
right.
it's inaccurate for the most part. It's
Mm-hmm.
actually very few. It's much more rare to truly be infertile.
That's a very good point. You're absolutely right. We use it as kind of an umbrella term.
Hmm.
And honestly, I use that word as a way of like identifying the type of
Communicating, yeah,
work,
I totally get it, and
right?
I use it sometimes too because it's what's used.
Yeah, but no, you're absolutely correct. It's a term that no longer fits what we now understand about reproductive processes.
Yes.
So yes, you're absolutely correct. What, just out of curiosity, what is your preferred, like, how do you
What
prefer
I
to
say
talk
is
about it?
fertility challenges I try to use, but
Mm,
sometimes I do. There's no other words but to say infertility when you're describing the diagnosis and, things like that, like unexplained
right.
infertility. So sometimes you do use it, but the reason why is because I feel like identification is so powerful.
Hmm.
And when we get like labels and words, like we really take it into our being.
Yes, we
And
cling
it's
to
just
it
like
so
to me,
hard.
I'm like that is just such a, you're taking another like hit through the
Hmm.
process. And I'm like, no, ouch, I don't like it.
Yeah, I have a kind of an, like, kind of like that. You heard me use the term spontaneous pregnancy.
Hmm.
I feel very strongly that the term got pregnant naturally or
Hmm.
something like that. I feel that that's incredibly detrimental to like the fertility treatment
Hmm.
community, because number one, it kind of continues to mystify what fertility treatments are,
Hmm.
which is like this playing God sort of a situation.
Hmm.
When really, if you've ever been through it, it's more like a science experiment than anything else.
Hmm.
Um, and then it kind of insinuates that whatever conception occurs is unnatural,
Right.
but it's a medical intervention, and we don't say like you had
It's all natural. Yeah, it's in the
right.
end of the day, it's all natural. You
We
get
don't talk
pregnant, you
about
have a
that.
baby.
Yeah, we don't talk about that in terms of like having an open heart surgery. Oh, you had an unnatural procedure because you had an unnatural medical intervention. We don't use that type of vernacular when we talk about that. Um,
Right.
so yeah, no, I love the like fertility challenges and things like that. Like just finding out those because language is powerful. You're absolutely right.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
people do hold on to those labels, just like they will
Subconsciously.
white knuckle those labels. And so I do talk to my community about like hold your labels lightly. A
Hmm.
label doesn't actually mean anything about you unless you make it mean something about you.
Yeah.
So yeah, I love that so much.
Yeah, yeah, and it's true. I mean, so there is kind of like the two parts to all of this. Part of it, it's almost like the serenity prayer. Some part of it's like things that you are basically being part of this process or getting traumatized by the process because of the way the process is. So that
Mm-hmm.
you're getting hit without your will, like against your will, without wanting to. It's not something you did or had anything to do with it. It just
Right.
what happened. So that's
Mm-hmm.
kind of like the one part of it. the other part of it is what can you do to empower yourself, because you can't change certain things, and then it's like those two leg, like what do you accept and then what do you do with that. And I love the
Right.
serenity prayer because of that. It's
Yeah.
like what can you control and what can't you control, and what do you just accept and what do you move on from, and what how do you like get it to the point where you actually can take some charge.
hmm Yeah, I talk about acceptance. Acceptance is one of the kind of the three pillars that I coach on. So awareness, emotional balance, and acceptance are the three things that I really focus on and interweave throughout my coaching program. And acceptance, what most people think of acceptance is that they get to a point where they suddenly feel good
Hmm.
about what's happening. Like all of a
Right.
sudden, you're just going to start shooting rainbows and daisies out of your bum.
Right, and that's the positive talk. What is it?
Toxic positivity.
But which I want to talk about that as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't believe that that's true for acceptance. I think acceptance looks more like this is happening,
Right.
right? That I am doing this. Do I want to go through IVF? Not particularly. Nobody wants to drop a year's worth of college tuition to
Yeah.
conceive a baby.
Right.
But this is what I'm doing because I want the outcome,
Yeah.
and I'm okay with that. Like I'm okay with taking that step. Um, and that be the end of the conversation. Like you don't have to put a silver lining on it. You don't have to feel good. But
Right.
when you fight, I shouldn't have to do this. This shouldn't be my life. That feels worse.
Yeah.
So that's and I love the serenity prayer because it is like this acceptance, like here I am, fault, when it's used in like the AA community and stuff like that, like faults and all, here I am, I'm doing my best, which is
Hmm.
very much where kind of our community is as well.
Yeah. Definitely. And now it's amazing because it's really blossomed, and so it is such a big, beautiful community. It really is like
Yes.
so much more accessible for people. And one of the things that I was thinking about before when we were speaking about it is that there's so many people that relate to what you're going through. A lot of times in the beginning, you feel like you're the only one until you start to realize,
Yep.
wow, like there's this whole community and so much amazing support. And that in
Mm-hmm.
itself is so beautiful. The best community. Worst club,
It,
best members.
yes.
Right.
And that's such a that tagline. I love it and I hate it at the same time.
I know, I know.
Um, I always kind of caution people because we want something so badly, and we want to be a support to those around us. What can happen, and I'm not saying it's inevitable or anything like that, but what can happen is what's called vicarious traumatization.
Hmm.
So you're in this community, and then just by the nature of exposure, the potential for you to hear some really awful stories
Hmm.
comes up. And so as much as you want to be a support and as much as you want to be just a love and light to other people who are going through it, you also have to make sure that you're taking care of yourself.
Yeah. Setting those
Because
boundaries.
yeah, like if it doesn't make you feel good to be on those boards, get yourself off,
Yeah.
take a break, snooze the boards, whatever you need to do. But that is a true thing that happens. Vicarious traumatization is basically I'm getting traumatized vicariously through someone else because of their story, right? Not
Yeah.
that the person did anything wrong by sharing their story, not that you're doing anything wrong looking at this story, but it is something that can happen. And
Hmm.
so you can love being a part of the community, you can love contributing to the community, and you can also love yourself enough to kind of step back when you need to. So that's always an important balancing act. Not
Yeah.
all of us get it right. I certainly didn't for a long time.
Yeah.
Um, but just being aware that that's a potential.
Yeah, and I think I'm really glad that you brought that up. That's actually a really, really good point. So let's go back to toxic positivity, because
Oh
there's
yeah,
such a
girl.
difference between surrendering, like you said, and then being having toxic positivity. What's the difference?
Yeah, so toxic positivity is when someone else or you, because you're just as culpable in the toxic positivity like yourself, When you are discounting your experiences by trying to put a positive spin on it, right? So a miscarriage, you suffer a miscarriage, and someone says to you, at least you know you can get pregnant, right? As if that's supposed to like solve for the pain and trauma that you're experiencing right now, right? Just don't lose hope, right? So that's pretty tricky because that presupposes that hope is the only way to go through this process. Curiosity, I find, is actually a little bit more helpful because you go through, 2.5 years of trying to conceive and not having any luck. You go to fertility treatments and you're not having any luck. Hope's a pretty difficult emotion to try to access. But you might be curious. I wonder if we try this, it could work. I wonder if this medication or this timed intercourse cycle, I wonder if it's
more
much
neutral.
More powerful. Correct. 100%. You got this. I don't want to get this. Maybe I want to be upset for just a minute and it be okay that I'm having a human emotion right now.
Right.
So it's anything that invalidates the current experience or emotions that you're having in the face of whatever, right? Because again, anything that we experience in a specific area of our life, you're going to experience it in other areas of your life.
Right.
Right. So I could talk for days about toxic positivity, but that's kind of in a nutshell, that's the difference between the two.
Yeah. And also, just like you said before, it typically comes in conversations where people don't know what to say.
Yeah. So I did a lot of work in hospice at one point in my social work career. And there's a beautiful book I think it's called The Art of a Healing Presence. And that book kind of changed my understanding of how people sit with someone who is in pain.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And I can probably send you the information on the book if you wanted to link it or anything. But
yeah,
the idea is that more often than not, when we try to make someone feel better, we're going to be really bad at it.
Yeah, you're right. Because we're invalidating.
Right. We're either invalidating or we're trying to make ourselves, so comparison is a big, this happens a lot in comparison. We're trying to create a bond through this. But comparison rarely, you're never going to, even if you could parallel the experiences, you're not going to parallel the pain, the emotion, the thoughts that you had or that each of you had. So comparison and invalidation.
So comparison meaning where the person's at that's speaking to the person who's in pain?
Yeah. So if you told me, we're going to have to do IVF. And I say, oh, I've done 2 full cycles of IVF and 3 cycles of, and 3 transfer cycles. I know what you're going through. I don't. Right. I'm not Michelle. I have no idea what you're going through. And so by trying to create some sort of bond, I'm actually just making it about me.
Right. Got it.
Right. Oh, look, I'm an expert in this. You can ask me questions. I've been there. It always comes from a good place. I believe it always comes from a good place, but it's actually one of the most damaging things you can do in a relationship is draw that comparison, because no comparison is ever right. Your loss is not my loss.
Right.
Your journey is not my journey. It's never
always going to be inaccurate.
Correct. Yeah. And so inaccuracy will always kind of plant that seed of, okay, I can't talk about this because everyone's going to try to relate to me. Everyone's going to just try and make me feel better. No one's just going to let me be sad or angry or resentful or whatever the emotion is. Right. So those are kind of the two toxic natures of those comments.
Yeah. Without a doubt. And so, what do you recommend for people in those positions? I know that I've spoken to some psychologists who have said have a couple of things as a backup to say so that you can kind of like nip it in the bud at the moment that it happens and kind of stop it because it's kind of like the boundaries to stop
Yeah.
the conversation from progressing.
Yeah. So because I'm a thought-based coach, I'm not really a strategy coach. I'm much more interested in how you manage your own mind. So number one is if you're going to share something with someone, I would always suggest you check in with you first.
Hmm.
Like, what am I going into this conversation expecting?
That's a good point. Yeah.
Because if I'm expecting if I'm expecting unconditional support and all I'm receiving is unsolicited advice, well then my expectation was misaligned, and like I can live with that, right?
Hmm.
So I have to know why I'm going into a conversation, whomever it is, like my mom, my husband, my friends, just checking in with yourself for just a brief moment. But let's say the conversation is evolving and you didn't have time to check in with yourself, because
Yeah,
that happens a lot.
of
um,
course.
then it's a lot about boundary setting. What are you and what aren't you willing to talk about? So let's do the example of someone relating to you. Now, I'm a pretty upfront person. I think I think most people would call me that. Some have called me other things. But in a conversation, if someone I'm having a conversation with says something, I'm I feel very confident and comfortable to tell them that's not the most helpful thing to say.
Hmm.
This is I know it comes from a good place. I'm just
Hmm.
curious why you thought that that would be helpful, right? So I tend to enter any interaction with the assumption that the person is trying their best.
Hmm.
And so I'm going to meet them with either compassion or at the very least confusion.
Hmm.
Yeah. I'm not sure why you think that particular scenario equates to what I'm talking about
Hmm.
or something like that. Um, Compassion, because some of these things, as difficult as they are for us to experience, for someone that loves us, it's also difficult for people to hear us go through those things.
Yeah.
And so if your mom is constantly telling you to like be positive or you could just adopt or something like that, that is because I'm guessing she's talking to
Hmm.
someone that she really loves and does not want to see hurting. And
Yeah.
so she thinks she's got like the answer. Be positive, just
Yeah.
adopt, or whatever that communication is. And the last thing is like you don't owe anyone your peace.
Right.
So if someone is, when my husband and I, before we got pregnant with our oldest, um, his mom's best friend, who's a woman, we were at a barbecue or something, and she said, when are you going to do your manly duty and get that girl knocked up?
Ooh.
I
Ah.
know, right? Classy,
Oh,
super classy. And
geez.
I remember just looking at her and I was like, I'm not sure why you think that that was an okay thing to say. And she started going down like this route. Oh, it was just a joke. And I was like, I appreciate that it was a joke. You can continue making your jokes, but I'm going to go talk to someone else.
Yeah.
Right? You don't owe anyone your
Right.
peace.
Jokes are supposed to be funny to the person you're saying it to, right?
Well, and it kind of doesn't matter. Like
Yeah.
if it's not a conversation that you want to be engaged in, just because we've been taught as women that it's polite to stick it out and not make other people uncomfortable, doesn't make it true. So
Yeah.
you can tell someone up front, like, I have no control over the words that come out of your mouth, as idiotic as they are, but I don't have to be here.
Yeah.
So I'm going to take myself out of that. Now, I understand that there are a lot of people in the world who aren't as comfortable being that direct.
Yeah.
But I think sometimes just giving someone permission to be okay to like, you can walk away.
Yeah. It's true. Yeah.
Right? When Aunt Carol gets drunk at the holiday party and she's spouting off some nonsense, she's not going to notice if you say, "Oh, you know what? I need to go to the bathroom." and then you're like ducking in corners to hide from Aunt Carol. So those are kind of my how I would approach it.
Yeah.
Is really checking in with yourself. What are you, and are you willing to have a conversation about? And you don't owe anybody your time or your peace or your mental health.
Amazing. Yeah, no, that's very, very wise words because it's true and we don't realize, I think people just don't realize the power that they can have
Mhm.
over anything, really their own kind of their own energy, their own personal energy and what they can give and what they don't need to give.
Right, right. And honestly, you're already giving so much of your emotional bandwidth, of your
Hmm.
psychological bandwidth, of your
Totally.
financial bandwidth.
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
Like let's just make sure that you, the individual, is at the forefront. No,
Yeah.
your partner, absolutely, absolutely in consideration, but if you're the one physically, emotionally, financially experiencing it, nobody else's opinion matters.
Yeah.
And it's not that, this is interesting. People have asked me, so do you just not care what other people think? Well, number one, it's none of my business what other people think. Certainly, like bar none, it's none of my business. But also, it's not that I don't care. I'm not a robot. It's not that I'm not a sociopath. I don't walk around not caring what other people think. But oftentimes I don't agree with them.
Hmm.
So if they think that I'm not doing something, but I feel really centered and secure that I am doing everything that I've been told, everything that I've researched, everything that I've communicated with my doctor, then your opinion is wrong.
Yeah.
And that's okay. You're allowed to be wrong, sit in your wrongness and be wrong. But I don't have to make that mean that there is something lacking within me. And I think
Right.
that's a big breeder of shame during this experience or during
Oh,
this journey.
absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that the reality is majority of people might blame themselves before they realize that it's actually not true what's being kind
Right.
of thrown at them and so but that's the reality and that's why
Mm-hmm.
it's important to really kind of stay within your own truth and honoring yourself through the
Absolutely.
process. Yeah.
Absolutely. We get very fixated on the baby, on
Mhm.
the end game.
Yeah.
And that's why a lot of women say that they kind of forget about themselves
Mhm.
during this process because we're so focused. But the baby is like, until the baby is like out of you and stateside, the baby is like 20% of the equation,
Mhm.
right? 80% of it is you and taking care of you mentally, emotionally, physically, financially,
Yeah.
and basically kicking your own butt throughout the entire. I have a phrase that I love to use. You can't hate yourself pregnant. You
Yeah.
can get pregnant hating yourself, but why? Why would you want the most important relationship that you have in this life, which is the relationship you have with yourself, to be full of that much hate and to bring that into this journey and to like hate yourself through what could be days, weeks, months, years. And so fostering kind of that relationship with yourself, even if it's as small as I'm doing my best.
Yeah.
Like my best looks very different from day to day, right? You get me on a day that I showered and did the hair and the makeup.
Mhm.
Tomorrow could look very different.
Yeah.
And so I think when we get so focused on the baby is the thing, that's when we start to really lose center and just just rake ourselves over the coals for some of the most inconsequential decisions that we can make, right?
Mhm.
Someone was talking about wax-based candles versus soy-based candles. And
Mhm.
I'm like,
Yeah.
if wax-based candles had that much influence over us getting pregnant, nobody would get pregnant because everyone uses wax-based candles until 10
Right.
years ago.
Yeah.
So things like that are really important, I think, during the journey.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, the mind state is like so important. It's really more important than anything else because ultimately everything else has a place and there's definitely impacts on the environment and everything. But if the mind is not there, because I see people in my practice that come in and they do everything quote unquote right.
Hmm.
I'm doing the diet, I'm doing this, and I'm like, well, is it impacting your stress level? Because ultimately, like, that's more important than anything else, than
Yeah.
having cheat days or whatever it is. Like, and I find that people get so stressed out that their body's not even moving the energy that they're producing from the good foods, because they're holding
Yeah.
it in place. There's so
That's
much tension.
that's so right. Like we have this cultural belief that there's a right way to do things and a wrong way to do
Mhm.
things. And that's not true. Like there's
But
so
bless
much
their
more
hearts, I get it,
nuance.
because you
Yeah.
you just want to do everything right because you just want so badly to start the family. So
Yeah.
so it's totally like understandable how that happens, but sometimes with that you can get
Hmm.
caught in the details, as you
Absolutely.
said. Yeah.
Absolutely. My reproductive endocrinologist, when we were going through our first round of IVF, she told me, Emily, it's you have to do something incredibly intentional or
Mm-hmm.
be incredibly neglectful
Mm-hmm.
to have that much influence over
Right.
that process.
Yeah.
And so as long as you can tick off the boxes that this wasn't intentional or there wasn't neglect, then that could be, she obviously, I'm using a little bit more neutral language. She's a very
Mm-hmm.
strong woman, and even I'm saying that. Um, but as long as you can kind of tick off the boxes, okay, I didn't, I attended all my doctor's appointments. I took all the medication that was prescribed, recommended, in the dosage and the mechanism in which it was requested. I did all of the things.
Mm-hmm.
That means I have done my best.
Right.
And so I think this idea of like good enough,
Yeah.
it
I think
really
that's
is.
definitely a societal thing. It's a conditioning thing for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, women have been told for centuries, you got to be everything to everyone all the time,
Yeah, that's right.
right? Perfectionism runs deep for a lot of us.
Yeah.
And even if we wouldn't constitute ourselves as perfectionists,
Hmm.
then we're usually doing the opposite to kind of counteract it.
Actually, I feel like society makes perfectionistic good. It's like a good thing to
They
be a
completely
perfectionist.
celebrate it.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, the characteristics of a perfectionist, which are often high functioning anxiety, is
Hmm.
celebrated in our culture.
Yeah, it is.
100%. And so that trickles down, right? How many women have you spoken to who like use what's the book? It Starts with the Egg as their
Hmm.
Bible.
Yeah.
Nothing wrong with it. The author has done. I
Oh,
prefer
she
this
did
the
an amazing,
revised
yeah.
version.
Yeah.
Um, but but
It
when
has
you
great
have a
information. It's a great resource.
great framework
Yeah.
to pick and choose, and that's why I like the second revision, because the author was a little bit more like, these are options. You don't
Yeah.
have to do everything.
Yeah.
Um, but I think we have that set in our minds that we have to do things perfectly,
Yeah.
and which isn't true. Like, you are allowed to not have to throw away all of your plastic containers for glass. You're allowed to not have to take two fistfuls of supplements every single day.
Yeah.
Um, so I think permission is a big thing.
It
Giving
is.
yourself permission to allow there not to be perfection, because perfection doesn't really exist.
Absolutely. It really doesn't. It's like, and it gives you a feeling of liberation when you realize
Mm-hmm.
that it just like you could just be and that's okay and actually it's
Yeah,
perfect.
yeah, yeah. You're perfect. You're good enough exactly
Exactly.
the way you are.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so if people want to reach out and work with you, how can they find you?
Yeah, so all of my stuff is IVF This Coaching. So Instagram and Facebook, IVF This Coaching. My website, www.ivfthiscoaching.com. And to stay on brand, the podcast is called IVF This.
I love it. It's not confusing at all because I have different
Nope.
names for it. I'm like, it's perfect. Oh my gosh, I could talk to you for hours
I know,
because
you
it's really
too.
so interesting and there's like and it is really all energy, right? I mean, everything that it's all this underlying energy that we either exist in or don't, but there's a lot of options that we can take as
Yeah.
individuals.
Yeah. And I love the idea of using the energy of your body. So I don't do energy healing, but we do a lot of mind body work, particularly around creating safety within yourself for your emotions, because most of us have been taught that if we're having a big emotion, that means something is wrong. When really it's just kind of like a dashboard indicator light on a vehicle saying that something's going on. And so, one of my favorite exercises is just grounding yourself, putting your hand on your heart and telling yourself nothing has gone wrong. I'm experiencing anxiety, grief, sadness, anger, whatever. And that's okay. Like, this is a normal emotion to experience. And when you get to the point where it's okay to feel an emotion, you always get to peace or calm on the other side of it. And you're going to get a hell of a lot more traction with peace and calm rather than trying to fight white knuckle through anxiety or anger or anything else. So like, it's okay if the big emotions are supposed to happen. But where can we put our energy that's going to be most impactful for you, for your life, for your family, for your future? Well, that's going to be in managing your emotions and making sure that you're safe just because you're experiencing them.
Oh, I love it. This is amazing words of wisdom. And it's true that getting in tune with your body really helps you navigate your emotions, because we always process it through our bodies and it really makes a difference. So thank you so much, Emily. This was amazing. Thank you so much for coming on today.
No, thank you for having me. This was amazing.
So that concludes today's episode. You can find all of the links mentioned on the episode notes. If you're enjoying these episodes, please take a moment to share and leave a review. Reviews mean everything to podcasters, and I really enjoy hearing from my listeners. You can also find me on my website at www.thewholesomelotus.com or email me at info@thewholesomelotus.com. I love hearing from my listeners. If you're interested and want updates as well as a free ebook on my top 10 fertility boosting habits, you can visit my fertility page on www.thewholesomelotus.com. I thank you so much for listening in and hope that you have a beautiful day.